Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts. Along with me, I have the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Gentlemen, in what is becoming a trend for Full Circle, we've lost another legend, Mary Wilson of the Supremes. And you know, when I think of Mary Wilson of the Supremes and I think of Motown, I think of how Motown was a Black-owned company, but they came out pursuing not Black America, but Young America. They wanted to be the sound of Young America. And so they kind of crossed over, did a type of music that was designed to, you know, appeal to everyone. Of course, again, with us coming from our different perspectives, as always, Dr. Holmes, let's start with you, because you remember probably the Motown sound from the beginning to the end. What did it mean for to have a group like the Supremes be so internationally recognized and internationally accepted, or did it mean anything to you personally?
Well, it's not the international acceptance and recognition, excuse me, but it was the sound that resonated, and it did resonate to me as a youth, you know, growing up in a rural area and then listening to that music, because it kind of distinguished that sound from the older blues, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I want to mention about Berry Gordy, you know, while we're talking about this, Berry Gordy's father was a Garveyite, so he had some of that Garvey influence in that, in the I guess in the thinking that this can be a Black-owned operation. And he was also someone who worked on the worked in the Ford, I don't know which plant, but he worked in an auto factory. And so it was that time when you had a strong industrial Black working class, when industry was still there, you know, in Detroit, hadn't left Detroit yet. And you had that energy and that sound, you know, and had all those kids from that neighborhood or from that community. He was able to bring them together and mold that sound, and had that rhythm section back there that, you know, back there that was so good.
Yeah, so we definitely want to salute that Motown blueprint, you know, the good and the bad. You know, it was a Black-owned company. Some of the artists complained about not making the money that they should have made. And again, we started off talking about Mary Wilson. Diana Ross became, you know, like the star of the group that was pushed to the forefront. But Mary Wilson blazed her own path as well. So we just want to, you know, give our condolences to her family. May she rest in peace, and she'll always be remembered. And she was my favorite one when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Everybody loved Diana Ross. I had to crush on Mary Wilson. You know, that was just me. I have my own taste. So Dre, understand you did a piece on a Tuskegee Airman yesterday. Let's talk about that briefly before we bring our guest on.
So I got a phone call on Tuesday morning from a reporter who said that she Googled Black history and Greensboro, and my name popped up. And I mean, if you know the history of Greensboro, to even be included in the history and have your name attached to it is something spectacular in itself. But she wanted to talk about some research I had done years ago on Charles Herbert Flowers, who was a Tuskegee Airman. He had gone to A&T, and he was studying pre-med and left school, did odd and end jobs, and ended up in the military. And he wanted to fly. He didn't want to be an infantry or anything. That he wanted his wings. So he went, did very well in his classes and scored very high. And instead of sending him to war, what they did, they said, all right, if you're this good, we want you to be a trainer to train everybody to be up to your level. So he was actually a trainer, and went back after the war. He went back to school at North Carolina Central and finished up there and blazed a career in academia. And there's a school named after him in Maryland, Charles Herbert Flowers High School. So it was just they reached out to talk to me about him and Black history, because not many people know about the civilian pilot training program that was instituted at 6 Black colleges, A&T being one of them, during the early part of the 40s. This was a Roosevelt idea that he wanted to train as many pilots as he could through the civilian pilot training program, gearing up for World War II. And it was just interesting to be able to speak and touch on the accomplishments of a fellow Aggie. And yeah, I was pleased to be able to share his story for Black history, because it's one that's not really talked about at all.
Hey, and we appreciate you sharing that. And what we're going to do, if you have access to our website, fullcircleshow.com, at the top, you have our social media icon. So we're going to post your video of you appearing on television. We can post that on our YouTube page, Instagram, and Facebook. So everyone, watching this, if you want to see that piece, then just access our social media. And next, we do have a special guest in the building. Let me just lay the groundwork for those who've seen our website and the story of how the Full Circle podcast came together. It kind of has its origins on when I first matriculated into the University of Akron in 1987. Coming from a predominantly African-American high school and coming into, I guess, what we call a traditional institution, I wanted to make sure that I was able to connect with, African-American students on campus. So I became, active in the Black United Students Organization. And when I went to the very first meeting, there was, I saw an exec board up front. First, I saw Dr. Neil Holmes, who was the staff liaison. But then I also saw an exec board, and there were a couple brothers on that exec board. And one of them, who was an inspiration to me, made me pursue, position in leadership with Black United Students later on, was Dr. Lathardus Goggins. He wasn't Dr. Lathardus Goggins yet, but, that would come later. Dr. Lathardus Goggins has an organization called Applied Academic Solutions. He's done tremendous work in education and consulting. So he agreed to speak with us today, and we're very appreciative to have him. Dr. Goggins, welcome, sir.
Welcome, man. Man, it's always good to reconnect with you and Dr. Neil Holmes. Yeah, those times at the University of Akron, it was formative, and those conversations with Neil was always challenging and prepared you for the struggle.
Definitely. Let me kind of set this up, and because you and I, we had a little conversation, obviously before tonight. And one of the reasons that I wanted you on, and I mentioned this to you, that a conservative talk show host, I saw something that he put on YouTube, an African-American conservative talk show host. He will remain nameless, but he was complaining, or actually criticizing, African-Americans who say that Black boys are disproportionately suspended in public schools. And he was saying that it's not systemic racism, it's the behavior of those Black boys, And so when I was researching your information, I saw that you had some of the modules that you had was effective interactions with African-American males. You talked about the difference between discipline and punishment. Why don't we start with that, effective interactions with African-American males? Why don't we start with that?
Okay, well, actually the beginnings of that started, we was talking in Philadelphia. I was a part of a group, Dr. Howard Stevenson, brother Robert Carter, Eric Grimes, and myself. We were all introduced through Dr. Doreen Lowry, who is with the Black Male Development Symposium there at Arcadia. And Dr. Stevenson was I think he's still out there, but he was at the time at UPenn, and he was putting together a course, was thinking about a course, psychoeducational interactions with African-American males. And we, the four of us got together, we put that course together. Phenomenal course, very interesting. The four of us co-taught it. This was a graduate level course. And for many times, for most of the students, it was the first time that they saw 4 Black males teaching the course at the same time. This was a graduate level course of educators, and many times the first course that they've had that focused on Black males. When I left Philadelphia and went to University of North Carolina, Wilmington, I took that concept and with effective interactions with Black males, African-American males, and did a course there and tied it back to Philadelphia. But it was the course that we taught in Watson School of Education. Unbeknownst to me, my grad assistant and I did some research looking at different programs across the state, found out we were the only course in the state of North Carolina that specifically was meant to prepare teachers and social workers, prepare teachers and pre-service social workers to work effectively with African-American males, a population that as a field, both social workers and teachers, education says, is a disconnect. And we were the only course in the state doing it. And coming back and finding out, it's still most places don't have, most teacher prep programs don't have this type of course. Frankly, do not have any expectation that as a teacher that you develop cultural competency, that you have. Most teacher prep programs may require one diversity course that basically is a survey course that says, there's other people that don't look like you, but there's no expectation of competency. And so you get teachers coming into a situation, you get a field that has well been documented, in which there's this disconnect, there's this bias, there's this unpreparedness to address issues, concerns around the African-American experience in general, and specifically African-American boys, right? So that's a long way to go around to say this person's attitude or this recognition that there's this disconnect. On one hand, yeah, you can say it's because the boys don't act right. Well, should you be, how comfortable should you be in a situation that is hostile and that tends to dehumanize you, right? How well adjusted should you be to something like that? How well adjusted should you be to adults and ideally professionals who are ill-equipped to recognize your humanity, who themselves have been socialized in a society that sees you as a threat, sees you as a problem. They've had no real experience or competencies or develop the skills necessary to be self-reflective, to check their own bias, and develop strategies to bridge their experiences to your experience as the adult and the professional in the room, right? Because that's not a child's responsibility to do that.
Right.
So how well adjusted should you be in that situation, right? So from one perspective, you may say that how these students are acting out would be normal.
Let me ask you, there's quite a bit of violence and so forth in our communities, and subsequent, I guess, trauma. One author has suggested that we have the level of violence is similar to what we see in a war zone. Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with the kind of trauma that's a result of not just the violence, but other tensions and pressures that our young people face?
And so that goes back to, right, so I work with Cleveland Metropolitan School District as a human-aware partner and which is SEL, Social Emotional Learning Partner. And it gets to one of that question gets to one of the major issues that's going on in social emotional learning, SEL realm, right? So social emotional learning is a big buzzword. Trauma informed. Dr. Genwright is pushing us toward this idea of healing centered, focusing on that, those kinds of things. Phenomenal sister, Dr. Dina Simmons. She talks about if you're not checking yourself, right? If you're not checking yourself, you're probably introducing trauma as you call yourself, trying to alleviate trauma or deal with this sense of SEL, social emotional learning. So how do you deal with it? One is Dr. Asa Hilliard said it best. Treat them like human beings. Second thing you do is love them. How do you recognize the humanity of the children in your class? I used to do professional developments, and what I used to say is, I give that quote from Dr. Hilliard, that say this thing from Dr. Hilliard, if this quote confuses you, then anything I'm going to say afterwards is not going to make sense to you, right? But I stopped doing that and started asking the question, what does treat them like a human being mean to you as a teacher in your classroom, in your school? All too often, way too much, I get a blank stare like, oh yeah, I have no idea. And then when I move to what does love them look like, I'll get folks who get downright mad that I've asked the question, right? And so when we think about trauma specifically, you think about what makes trauma traumatic, because again, it's one of those buzzwords that a lot of folks throw out. And I give this analogy of, a small dog walks into a room suddenly. Are you traumatized? Most folks, nah, cute, all right. Tiger walks into a room. Are you traumatized? Well, yeah. I said, what's the difference? And what it boils down to is my sense of power, right? Efficacy. What can I do? Small dog, no big deal. I feel I can deal with it. Tiger, another thing. If I said to you, tomorrow at noon, I'm going to bring a tiger into the room. Are you traumatized? Nah. Why? I won't be here, right? So I got choice. You give me predictability and the power to choose, the permission to choose, trauma goes down, right? Or if I tell you, not only do you have a choice with the predictability, I have a plan. I don't have to be, I can schedule, I have a solution in my head, right? So what makes trauma traumatic? Sense of power, predictability, plan, right? So how do you address trauma? How do you provide students, persons, opportunities to exercise the power, recognize the power that they have, and exercise it, practice it? How do you build in the routines, the rituals that allows me to have a sense of how the day should be ordered, how life is ordered, how I fit into the world around me? Greeting rituals, all these kinds of things that we do as human beings, right? So this goes back to treat them like human beings. And then how do you recognize my humanity by treating me like I'm an intelligent person and giving me strategies for life, right? Treat them like a human being. Recognize all humans are hardwired to socialize, to protect, to learn. You do those kinds of things. And that will reduce the level of quote unquote trauma. If I know that the stuff that's going on out there that I'm seeing, I could do something about it, right? Those are the conversations we had with you, Neil. You were like, take a look around you. This craziness, you think that's like, and then you would say, here's what you need to organize. You needed this. Did you read this? Do you have this, right? And out of it didn't take us out of the experience. For many of us, it sent us head on into it. But we was equipped. We had a sense of purpose. We had something that we can do about it. And we was ready for the struggle. Right? So how do you address trauma? You address it by doing those kind of things. And love. How do you feel a sense of belonging and caring and knowing you got a tribe, knowing you got people, knowing, all that kind of stuff, and making those human connections. And you do that in a classroom. So you see all those, the folks that did all the fancy handshakes. Everybody had to, that thing was hot for a while. Well, obviously we can't do it now because everybody's socially distant. But just simply by calling a child by their name, having a child hear their name, not when they're in trouble, but just to recognize you're standing in front of me, that you're here. I see you. That kind of stuff. Ubuntu, right? I am because we are because I am. That child knows that my connection to them is not just because you're a paycheck to me, but we are connected in our humanity. That is how you do this stuff. And the struggle is all too often. I'm sorry, I'm getting on. I feel like I'm on the soapbox, but the struggle is all too often that we have adults that want to do things to children and not do things with children, and recognize both, if you call it trauma sensitive, healing centered, SEL, social emotional learning, those are things that are to be done with children, how we are with each other, with the adults, with the children. These are not things or strategies to be done to children.
I know, Dre, I know you have a question, but I wanted to touch on that myself because I can speak to that from personal experience. Just the fact that, when I came to the University of Akron and I wanted to get involved in the Black United Students, you guys, Dr. Goggins, Dr. Holmes, you guys were much more mature and much more focused probably than I was, much more serious. But I never felt like you all tried to change me at all. It was kind of like, this guy has a lot of energy, we just gonna embrace it. And I felt accepted. And so then I was able to even move up in the organization, became chairman of the political action committee, became a first vice president at one point. Whereas if you would have made me feel ashamed of having that youthful energy or that immaturity, probably at that time, 18 years old, I probably would have rejected the organization, but so I'm just saying that's my personal experience in saying that what you're saying is dead on, 100% accurate.
What struck me was what you said about having a child find their sense of belonging, where they fit in. And coming from Philadelphia, that experience for me happened when I got to high school. And that's because I was introduced to an African Rites of Passage program at my high school.
You in Imhotep?
Yes. No, I went to Ben Franklin High School.
Okay.
So while I was at Ben Franklin, and this was very early on as a freshman, you get to high school and you're everywhere. Like Mr. Roberts said, he was, immature when he got to college. I was definitely immature when I got to high school. I thought football was my fit. I was the fat kid on the football team. I didn't have a name yet. I was bullied in the hallways, and then it's just like, well, where do I fit? And that's when I was introduced to the African Rites of Passage program. And I started realizing that I had much more power than I thought. Mm-hmm. Do you think, with listening to you with the SEL, do you think that incorporating African Rites of Passage into schools would be a good point, a good jump off to have in a school so people would have a better understanding of where they fit?
My first book, you see that?
Mm-hmm.
African Civil Rites of Passage Education. Yes, for sure. It is rites of passage is the universal way in which humans develop, right? And so yes, for sure. There's a lot of, I'm doing some writing and doing some research now. Actually, I'm doing a 25th. That's 25 years since that book was first published, and I'm updating it now. with reflections on SEL and some of this stuff. Yes. And yeah, because you get down to that fundamental question, right? So a part of what rites of passage, one of the major tenets, right? The 10 implications is that we're all one with the Creator and the cosmos. We're all born to succeed, and we all born with the capacity to express that capacity to succeed. That we're all trying to figure out a way to succeed, right? That all humans are built to learn or hardwired to learn. The question becomes, unfortunately, the answer, unfortunately, tends to mismatch what it is that I'm trying to fulfill, right? So particularly as a young person I do not have the knowledge, the understanding, the wisdom. I'm searching, right? I'm looking for. So much of our understanding of ourselves is this reflection back to us, right? I know myself to be Lathardus because everybody else called me Lathardus. It's not like I chose that name, right? And one of the reasons why people who go through these levels of consciousness, sometimes for them, one of the most liberating things to do is to choose your own name, because it's one of the things because it's always been given, it was something that was always given to you, right? So all that to say that in a school, you got to ask this fundamental question of what's the purpose of it? What is the purpose of it? You're a historian, Louisiana, particularly as a Catholic state or Catholic, rooted in the Catholic Church, it was incumbent upon the slave master to provide a good education to the slave, right? That was a part of the edict of the church. That's what you're supposed to do. Now the question becomes, what is, and this gets back to the original thought, Dave. But if I'm a slave master providing an education to a slave, or a person that I see as a slave, is to be more accurate about it, what kind of education will I provide? At best, it's going to be a very good slave, right? If I'm a teacher standing in a classroom, and my understanding of people like you, or you Black boys in particular, given our initial thought, is that you're hyper. You're 2 strikes against you and you're on your way to prison. That your culture is inherently inferior, right? That anything that I provide for you, even with the best of intentions, will be how to be a very good inferior person. How is it that I can help you overcome yourself? I'm going to provide you every opportunity, quote unquote, to learn not to be yourself, to not recognize yourself, right? And in that type of environment, of course, I'm feeling discomfort. Of course, I'm feeling disconnected. Of course, I'm experiencing trauma, and whatever the issues that being in a society that has historically denied my family, my people, my neighborhood resources, right? That whatever all the stuff that comes with that, the poverty, the insecurities of even knowing where I'm going to be at home, all that kind of stuff that enters into and is a part of that trauma response that we talk about. Even with all of that, if in the classroom I'm experiencing a disconnect, I don't see myself in the curriculum. Everything that you present to me suggests that I'm a problem, of course I'm going to act out. That's you can count on it. That's actually quite normal. You would think a person who wouldn't respond, you have to wonder what's wrong with them, right? So if you're ill-equipped, if you won't recognize, or in some cases, I'll get myself in trouble here, but I'm going to say it anyway, that if you fundamentally believe that inferior stuff to be true, or if you built your identity on the false notion of white supremacy, then you can't experience, you won't experience, you couldn't have anything other than an outcome of this kind of disconnect, right? Because if I fundamentally, explicitly or implicitly believe in white supremacy, then Black excellence cannot be possible. And so the things that I'm going to introduce, the things that I'm going to implement, even if it's an SEL lesson, even if it's quote unquote trauma informed, is going to fundamentally teach you how not to be yourself. It's fundamentally going to disconnect you, fundamentally going to bring about harm at some point.
And you know, that's interesting. That makes me think of, it's something that kind of touched on a piece I was thinking about. Just last week? The gentleman the movie Lean on Me was made about. What was his real name?
Joe Clark.
Joe Clark. And I remember in the movie, when he fired the music teacher, well, you know, the character Morgan Freeman was playing him, but fired the music teacher. And so the superintendent was getting on him about firing the music teacher. And he said to the superintendent, her missionary zeal about Mozart has nothing to do with our problem, you know, because he had interrupted her while she was trying to teach the kids, you know, how to sing Mozart to go participate in a competition. But what did that have to do with anything that they were dealing with? I think that was in Patterson, New Jersey, where they were living. So to me, that was the most, you know, it was a great movie. I enjoyed it at the time, although I didn't agree with all of Joe Clark's tactics, but that's a whole nother discussion. But that was my favorite part, that little piece right there. Her missionary zeal about Mozart has nothing to do with our problem. Now, Dr. Goggins, with the time we have left, a little bit of time we have left, I know you're in demand and you're gonna have to run later. Let's just assume that most people that are going into education, going to teach young African-American boys, have the best of intentions. Let's just assume that. We know that's not the case, but let's just assume that they all have the best of intentions. Even with those great intentions, what are some of the biggest mistakes that they can make or that they are making?
Well, let me just say, as much as I critique education, I'll give you intentions, right? I'll give you good intentions, but I often say that if I walk across the street and a car hits me and break my leg, I really don't care what your intentions were. When the ambulance show up, fix my leg. You busy trying to, you know, well, I don't care about all that. My leg is broke. Fix my leg, because how you treat my leg has nothing to do with your intentions, right?
Right.
So with that said, I think this idea of humility, I think is fundamental. The ability to be willing to listen to another person's lived experience and let that inform you. The savior syndrome, that, you know, going to work with these poor folks and all you can see is the trauma. All you can imagine is the problems, and I'm like, you know, there's a certain amount of, you don't have to teach grit to a lot of, you know, to us, you know, the fact that we're here, we are the this is one of the things I learned from Neil, you know, we are the people who they could not kill, right? So you're not teaching grit to me. You got to recognize it, and how do you connect to it? And I think that's, to me, more than anything else, my time at Arcadia was the lack of imagination, the inability, go back to Dr. Hilliard again, to see the full humanity. That even if the child is poor, comes from a poverty neighborhood or a rundown neighborhood to you, I can promise you there's joy there. I can promise you that there's some laughter, there's some things that are going on in that experience that, one, as a professional, you can learn from. Two, there's some strengths there that you should capitalize on and help recognize and build on, that a child can then begin to understand what is my power, provide, and be able to see the world around them and understands with some predictability about how things work, and develop a plan how to engage and utilize the strengths that they have, and then build upon those experiences through a facilitated professional, right? A teacher, educator, to build upon those, to how to work it, how to make these things happen, find some sense of purpose, and develop their sense of purpose, those kinds of things. So I think, to me, if there was the one magic wand thing that I could do, is that sense of humility that allows people to see the full humanity of the students in front of them, and recognize that there are strengths and social capital and resources there that should be tapped into. And as an educator, quite frankly, the quality of your professionalism is your ability to recognize those things and put them into play.
It's interesting when you say that, because one thing that I've noticed in my years of education is that I've noticed a lot of teachers working with African-American males focusing on the pants sagging thing, because that's been going on for like 30 years. I mean, when I was in college and I was a junior, the freshmen that came in, they were sagging their pants, and years later, it's still going on. Now, I admit, I don't like it myself, but I'm not going to write a kid off as a human being because he chooses to follow a fashion staple that other teens do. I did the same thing. There were certain things. I wore fat shoelaces in my Adidas. I look back on it now, it looks silly, but that's what everybody was doing. So that's what I did. Mm-hmm. Other kids wore do-rags, I wore a do-rag too. It's just following the crowd as you do as a teenager. Could you talk a little bit about that? How we tend to focus on one little thing. You kind of touched on it, but we focus on that one little thing and stay there.
But see, that speaks to, again, as the adult and the professional, right? Because those two things together are important, all right? Because we're dealing with a young human being, and all too often, like here in Ohio had the highest expulsion rate for preschool Black boys. And it's like, there's a certain part of me as an adult, as a man, as an adult, I'm not going to even admit that some 4-year-old got me so scared that I got to put you out. You know what I'm saying? There's something that's like, really? That's what you're going to go with? But as the adult and the professional, you have a perspective that should be broader than this newer human being. Right? Someone who has not dedicated their lives to a profession. So you should not expect them to have this bigger, broader palette of choices and understandings. That much of what we understand about ourselves is that reflection back. So what is it that they have seen in their lives, their education to that point, that says this is acceptable, impossibly if they experienced other things, but not things that are foreign to them, things that are connected. You can draw this connection. This is a part of, again, being the adult and the professional. You should be able to draw this connection back to. So I'm not asking you to be something other than yourself. I'm hoping provide these opportunities for you to expand yourself, right? To take up more room, to take up more whatever, right? That knowing that just because I go to Mexico and I speak Spanish in Mexico doesn't mean that I stop being Dr. Goggins. I know another language, right? So how do you learn to translate yourself in multiple situations? That's a part of the learning experience, right? So you build upon these things, and you learn to deal with what are some of the essentials and what things are preferences. If this is my preference, then get over it. Deal with the essentials, right? Because it's the same thing. Every generation has some kind of thing that they do that the old folks be like, huh? Right? That's every. If they didn't do it, you were like, what's wrong with y'all?
Right.
So, it's all that, it's one of those kind of things. Sometimes you got a bunch of people and you're like, are you sure you like human beings? You sure you like kids? Because this is the stuff that kids do.
Right.
This is the stuff that they've always done. And again, as the adult and the professional, how do you work that? How do you use that to your advantage? How do you pull that off? When I was teaching math and science, Dr. Goggins, you need a hook, no, I don't do that. I got my butter. For me, it was butter Tims, and that was all I'm going to do. Butter Tims. That's the coolest I'm going to get. That was it, right? But that becomes my thing, and and it becomes this kind of this back and forth, and this cool thing. They recognize, okay, but it just becomes how do you recognize the human being? How do you acknowledge the process and the passage? Make these connections, but at the same time, what they've learned was over time, oh, okay, this is why he does that. That's why he carries himself this way. Okay, yeah, okay. And so it's just, you plant those seeds, but you got to be connected, right? You got to be connected. And if all you doing is focusing on, this thing that's making you, I don't understand and it gets on my nerves,
right,
and you won't build a relationship with them. You won't connect and understand perspective. You won't relate to how you did something very similar, and somehow another, all that kind of stuff. You just, you want to have influence over anyone, build a relationship with them.
Exactly.
How do you know if you're being successful? How do you measure success, or what have been some of your most rewarding outcomes of your work?
Students who recognize their power. Students that I'm not a teacher, right? So I don't call myself as a teacher, but I worked at a middle school where I told the teacher, what I know is I know math. And so went in and the kids were talking about, I don't do math. We don't do math. And parents were like, Dr. Goggins, you in here treating our kids. I'm like, are you sure the argument you want to make with me is that I have too high expectations for your child? Right? Now, I know I could say that because my connection to the community is unquestioned, right? So I'm not speaking down, but then shortly, yeah, it got about a year. But after that, had parents like, Doc, they doing so and so and so and so. I I had one student who left and was at the high school selling her notes, her middle school notes that she did in my class, selling them to the high school students at the high school she was at. You know, but when you seeing students recognize their power, that's, to me, that's the, and the testing stuff will take care of itself after that point. The testing stuff will take care of themselves, but recognizing and seeing that power, the stuff that you did, Neil, you would pull us aside and have this conversation. Look, you know, you got to think about it. I saw, you know, and we were, oh, Neil, you this old revolutionary, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, you invested in us, you planted in us. And even sometimes years later, you sit down and think, yeah. I'm still learning lessons from Mrs. Neal, my first grade teacher. You know, but it's to me, that's the success. The success is when you plant those seeds and you begin to see them grow, and students begin to recognize, oh, okay, and they acknowledge their own sense of power. That's, to me, that's the measurement for me.
And Dr. Goggins, with that, I promised you I would get you out in time for your next meeting. So with that, we better close out. We're going to have you come back on again, because I would definitely like to talk to you about an experience I had at a school, an elementary school in Prince George's County, one of the most affluent Black counties in the country. But I was at the school I was in, it was just not a positive experience. We're going to have to talk about that, and I want to get your take on that. But on our in our social media, I will post a link to your website so people can go and see some of the books that you've written if they want to pick something up and just see some of the work that you're doing. So again, brother, I thank you for joining us. I thank you for your impact on me, you know, just like I always thank Dr. Holmes. And for everyone out there that's, again, watching this on YouTube, we thank you for supporting us, and we'll see you on the next broadcast of the Full Circle podcast. Thank you.
Yes.